In the previous video, I fabricated all of the pieces of the chain link that holds the sword on Guts' back. I also started machining the half moon handguard for the sword, so let's get right back into that whole fiasco and finish it up. Alright, so we are on to the next step. I'm going to make this groove. You can see I just kind of haphazardly marked it out here. It's going to be an inch from the edge, just over ½ inch wide, and it's going to be a ½ inch deep. This should be much easier to do. I've moved the clamps out to the edge so I don't have to keep, moving them around every time. I should be able to do continuous rotations basically. Probably going to take like 4 passes. I'll do half depth, then full depth. Then I'll kind of like kiss one side and then kiss the other side to just clean it up, make it a nice surface finish, and hopefully it'll be minimal cleanup when I'm done. Alright, we've got the slot roughed out to full depth. You can actually see the 2 steps in there, the ½ inch for each step. And you can see how rough this is. I don't know if that makes any sense, but since I was removing so much material, I was hand feeding it just to kind of keep an eye on things. And you can almost see like every revolution that I did by hand. My goal now is just to remove a small amount of material from the inside and the outside. And I'll do it with my homemade power feed. Hopefully this works out and gives me a nice smooth finish. And I won't have to spend a million years hand sanding it out. Alright, that's that for the machining. You can see the surface finish on the walls is absolutely dramatically better. I actually went a little bit better on the outside. I really sped the machine up top speed to really try to get a good finish. So the outside is a little better than the inside, but it's not really super dramatic. Some light sandpaper, wire wheel, Scotch-Brite should clean that all up. Honestly, the floor is probably the worst part, but that is not terrible. It feels nice and smooth, so it'll be a minimal amount of work. Only thing to do now is to cut this thing down the center so I can put, half of it on one side, half of it on the other side. I just need to remove as little material as possible while splitting it, so I need to think on that just a little bit. Okay, here we are. We're finally gonna split this thing in half, but first, we need to put a nice groove right down the center of it. The idea here being I'm going to put the groove in it, then I'm going to cut it in half, and it will leave me with a perfect bevel even on both sides of the 2 halves of this handguard. Now the bevel is actually a design element that I nearly forgot about. If you look at any of the manga drawings, there is a substantial chamfer on the edge of the handguard. It's not so much a decorative thing as it is a functional thing. I found this out myself. The issue is when there's a handguard with a sort of a 90-degree edge on it, it digs into the edge of your hand when you're swinging the sword really, really, really badly. If you watch my last Smash video, I actually ended up with a double blister, like a blister with another blister under it once that blister popped, and it left a scar for about a year, like right about there on my thumb, where it was rubbing on the edge of the handguard. So it's kind of funny if you think about it. It's a fantasy manga, sure, but they had the foresight to have a little bit of thought into that handguard, how that would actually work. I assume so anyway, unless it's just a massive coincidence, but I doubt it, honestly. I can't really think of any other reason why there would be a chamfer, where your hands go on the handguard. So, long story short, I have lined this piece up so that it is perfectly in line with the movement of the machine. I used my laser to do that earlier. The idea here is I'm going to use this little V-bit cutter. I don't know if you can really see it or the camera's blocking the light, but it's a 45-degree V cutter, and it'll cut a 45-degree V groove in this material. The idea here is I'm gonna basically use the entire depth of this cutter, cut a nice groove in the material, and then I'm gonna use that spindle over there with a slitting saw sticking out of it to then cut the piece in half, and I won't have to reorient this workpiece here. It'll still be perfectly aligned. May have to trim the tops off these studs. I'm not sure if it'll clear. I've already had to do quite a bit of finagling to get this to go here. I use these little tiny clamps so that they will clear on either side of the cutter as they come through, or rather that giant nut anyway. And I have just enough clearance here. I mean, that is really tight. Let me turn the machine on for a second here. You can see that just barely clears, but it's good enough. So one last note on this. This is a different V-bit cutter. It's actually the same dimension, just a different brand. The issue here is the surface speed on the outside of the cutter is going to be optimal, but the surface speed at the center is going to be almost nothing. There will be a huge disparity, right? Now this cutter is made from solid tungsten carbide, which is extremely strong, but extremely brittle. So what is probably gonna happen is the tip of this thing is gonna break off, simply because, you know, the workpiece is getting fed into the cutter, and the cutter can only spin so fast, especially on this old girl. This is a 1938 machine, doesn't have a very high speed, so there's a possibility that I'm literally going to be pushing the workpiece into this thing and it's just going to snap the center of it off because it can't cut fast enough. I guess that's the best way to explain it. To try to combat that, I am going to run this machine at its highest speed, and I'm also going to feed the workpiece into the cutter at the lowest possible speed. So low that this cut, it's a little over 8 inches or something like that. I think it's going to take 12 minutes. 12 minutes to make one pass. So it's gonna be pretty boring, but you know, what are you gonna do? Hopefully, if the cutter does break, it's just the very tip, just a little bit, and you know, I can go back after I split it in half and I can kind of finish the bevel. You know, if it's 90% complete, I can use it as a template to just kind of finish it by hand. It would be nice if I could make a perfect cut though, because then I could use the groove of the cut to line up the slitting saw later and make it, you know, relatively perfect, or at least easier to do. For the 3 actual machinists watching this, yes, I could have used a flat bottom cutter and then just tilted the head at a 45-degree angle so it made a perfect groove. Problem is trying to line it up, you know, line up that leading edge of the cutter when it's angled into this, you know, center line here. It just seemed more trouble than it was worth. And again, even if the tip of the cutter does break, I think I'll be okay as long as it doesn't break too much. And for that matter, this is a double-ended cutter, and I have another one as a backup, so hopefully eventually I'm able to make one complete pass here. But we'll see. Alright, I would say that was a success. That's the first time I've ever done this without breaking the tip off. If I zoom in a little, you look carefully, there's a little rub mark right there, right on the edge. It goes all the way around. And you'll see it's because you can kind of see there's a little step at the top of the cut, right up there. That's because I had to plunge the cutter deeper than it's rated for. I wanted a deeper bevel, and this was the biggest cutter I could find on a short notice, so I just kind of went a little too far, and I've got this little step that I'll just file out later on. But I really wanted this bevel to be a little deeper than the cutter could handle, so even that seemed to work out pretty well. I'll be able to touch that up by hand, and we've also removed a significant amount of material for that to cut through. It's maybe a third of the way, almost a third maybe. I've got this nice little groove right down the center where I will line up the saw, and I guess we'll see how that goes. Alright, so I'm utilizing the same setup as before. I took off these other clamps because there's just no clearance under that tool holder to do this. I'm not too concerned about it. This is still very tight to the table with these clamps. and I'm going to be cutting really slow, so I don't expect to be kicking this out of these clamps. Got my coolant set up over there. I've got this lined up basically as perfect as possible in the center of that groove, and I'm going to try to take this in 3 passes. I know a lot of people do this in 1 pass, but I only have 1 slitting saw this size. I've never used a slitting saw before, so I'd really like this to not explode. That would be great. Alright, so I ended up stopping the cut in the middle of its travel here. I don't know if it was noticeable, but the blade actually stopped spinning for like half a second during the cut, and that can be an extremely dangerous situation because if the blade stops spinning, but the table continues to move the workpiece, you know, through the material, it's going that way actually, it will shatter the blade. And that's true of basically any sort of milling operation. So I wanted to do a little investigation to see what the issue was. I'm honestly surprised it didn't shatter the blade. I guess it was just either so brief, or my current theory is that the table also stopped feeding at the same time the blade stopped moving, which tells me there's an issue with the drive system. So if I come back here, I think I've actually found the problem. Now, I've taken the old belts off here, but you can see there's pulleys for 5 belts. When I came back here, I discovered that there were only 4 belts, which I knew about, but I figured 4 was okay for now. However, one of the belts was completely slack. It was this one, and you can see how there's like this polished surface on that pulley because the belt has just been slipping. So I was actually down 2 belts. The remaining 3 seemed pretty worn, and they were somewhat loose. Not badly, but considering I was down 2 belts and I had 3 kind of slack belts, I figure I was running at 50% or less power before, you know, I was getting slippage. I assume that's what happened because if the table stopped feeding, that means just nothing was happening in the system because these belts were slipping. This is the actual motor down here. The motor wasn't transferring power to anything in the machine. That's my theory anyway, but long story short, I'm gonna replace all 5 belts right now. I raided 4 of the local auto parts store and just got some belts. Technically, these are not the correct belts, or rather, they're the correct part number. There's a pile of them down there, but these are really more for like automotive applications. And for this, where I have 5 belts, they really need to be precisely matched, right? Because one can't be slightly longer or shorter than the others, or you're gonna have a tensioning problem. I'm gonna throw these belts on for now just to solve my problem, but I'll have to look into getting a match set later on, which is ungodly expensive, but what are you gonna do? All right, that was simple enough. I ended up adding quite a bit of tension as well. I've kind of got these inside ones a bit overly tensioned, and then this outside one and this one are somewhat loose. These are probably right where they should be, and these other 3 are slightly too tight. I kind of want it too tight because I figured the tight ones will stretch or wear, and then the loose ones will be, you know, just right. Otherwise, if I have it a little bit loose, then the loose ones are just going to be slipping, and I'm going to have the same problem. Worst case scenario, these just wear out really fast. But I need to order a match set anyway, so I guess I don't really care. These aren't so tight that I think they're really gonna put, you know, significant wear on the bearings and such. Obviously, these are massively huge structures, and they should be able to handle quite a bit of load. I mean, look at the size of this motor. I don't know if you can see compared to my hand here, but it's like a 250-pound motor at least, I would say. I think it'll be fine. That thing's been running for 84 years, so I think they built it pretty well. Alright, I think I've identified the issue here. If you're not familiar with, you know, any kind of arbor or large end mill or whatever, they've got a shaft that goes in there and it's got 2 flat surfaces on it, just like this. This is actually the tool I took out of there originally. And you stick the set screws in the holes, you tighten them down on the flats, and then it prevents this thing from rotating. And when I look in there, those are not flat surfaces. That's just, that's part of the shaft. So I must have tightened the set screws down on the wrong point, or they loosened up, which let this rotate. So not a catastrophic problem, but now I just got to get this thing out of here, which may be more difficult than it sounds, because if it's been spinning in there, it might have a burr built up, and it's either a very, very, very tight fit to begin with, so that should be exciting. Okay, got it out of there, not too much trouble. Interestingly enough, I don't see any scratches where the thing was rotating against those set screws, so I guess the set screws just loosened up? Or maybe I didn't tighten them in the first place? It doesn't really seem likely. I'm usually kind of overly enthusiastic about things like that, so I'm not really sure. Actually, I wonder, do those flats even line up with those holes? Is that what the whole problem is? Stand by. Okay, I've discovered what may be the problem, and that is, you can see the flats in there now. They're nice and lined up perfectly, but there's a little gap right here. I think before I had this arbor all the way in, and the flat surfaces were a little bit too far that way, and the set screws were just kind of right on the edge, I guess. Kind of like this, where this raised section is, where the bevel is. You know, if the set screw is off center, you can see it's a very precise fit, so if it's slightly off center, it's not going to seat right. It would have been like that or something like that. Can't really see if on the viewfinder if you can see what I'm talking about, but I think it was just catching the edge just like that. So I'm gonna line it up a little bit better. I'm gonna crank the hell out of these things, and what are we on, like round 3? Just trying to make it, we're not even halfway through this cut yet, so. Yeah, so I've got it all back together now. I really cranked down those screws, and you can see the arbor sits in a different spot now because the saw blade is not quite centered on that slot. So I'm gonna have to readjust my cut and give it a go. Well, that's that, I guess. So I backed the blade out of the cut, and I basically recut the section I already cut, you know, assuming that the blade wasn't perfectly centered on my old cut. I did my best, but it was probably not 100% perfect, right? And a few seconds after it hit the part where it had last failed, it failed again. And that's it for this blade. I don't know if you can see this. Yeah. Nice crack appeared right there. I don't know why it would have stopped. I guess the only thing I can think of is maybe I should have cut deeper to redo that cut, because, you know, it had the blade had stopped in the cut last time, so maybe there was a little impression, you know, where one of these teeth had kind of stuck in the material and then jammed up. So when it got to that point again, it just jammed again. I guess that's all there is to it. That's, what? 4 days of work wasted, because I'm just gonna go over to the bandsaw and cut this stupid thing in half. At least I have a really nice line to follow now. This should be easy to do, but sheesh. So small update, I started disassembling this cutter, and I don't know if you can see this, but the key is actually sheared off, or at least partially. This thing is jammed on here pretty good. Oh, I guess that's that. Let's see if I can hammer this thing off. Yikes. Yep, check that out. Hot the key sheared right off. That's something. So that blade got really jammed up in there. I don't really know how or why. I mean, even with that previous cut existing, I was basically running the machine as slow as possible. It actually is the slowest feed rate possible. And the minimum, very minimum recommended RPM for this blade. So I couldn't have been more careful, but I don't know. All right, one last note on this stupid blade before I throw it in the trash. I did notice this. You can actually see some wear marks on the edge here. It looks like the blade was rubbing on this side. It's only on that one portion of the blade, and it's not on the other side. So maybe the blade got warped or bent when it jammed up the first time, and then when I tried to put it in the same cut, it just kind of bound up. That had to have been it, I guess. I don't know. I've been wrong every single time, so who knows? So as anyone who has ever watched this channel knows, when I say I'm giving up, I am not giving up. So I figured I've already broken about $100 worth of tools. Let's go for 200. So I've got a smaller slitting saw on here with a smaller tool holder. So I have clearance still under there when it passes over. And I figured I'd give this a shot because this is a side cutting slitting saw. Basically both sides of it look like this. It can actually cut, you know, not just on the tooth, but on the edge. So it's much harder to bind it up, or at least, you know, theoretically. I'm also going full depth on this cut. I'm gonna go all the way through, all the way to the other side, trying to like get under that section that might have some sort of burr on it that catches the blade. Who knows? I figure it's also less likely to bind up if I'm going full depth because the chips can fall out the bottom instead of kind of compacting in that slot. That may have been what caused the initial problem. I'm not really sure. I have a million theories and probably none of them are right, so let's go break some more tools before I finally break down and just bandsaw this thing. Well, I can scarcely believe it myself, but I think it worked. I stopped the cut because I could see the pieces getting wider at the end, which tells me it is cut. Yep, look at that. It's just held on by a little bit at the end. I'll clean that up. I just didn't want the cutter, once it actually cleanly cuts through, I didn't want it to grab the piece and kind of like eject it. That would be crappy. So I'll just do this a little bit. Wow. Absolutely amazing. Alright, so why did that work when the previous attempts failed? The real answer is I actually have no idea. I mean, I tried so many different things, I changed so many parameters, and it didn't really seem to matter that much until the very end. Theoretically, everything seemed fine, but obviously the cut was just jamming up and breaking the tools and so forth. So spinning it faster meant less of material is being removed by each tooth as it comes around, and you know, it creates this kind of slurry. It's much finer chips, and it's not really optimal, but I guess it worked. Theoretically speaking, I guess I was wearing out the cutter faster, but you know what really wears out cutters is when they break in half. So long story short, I don't know, maybe I should have started with a full depth cut to begin with, but I figured if anything that was putting more strain on the cutter. Conversely, it worked better. I don't know. I guess I'll chalk it up to a learning experience. Alright, we've got this thing cleaned up a little bit just to see how it looks, and I would say it's not too bad. There's one defect right there. This is from the first time I had the saw blade kind of spin in the holder because of those set screws. And then when I went to put the blade back in the slot, it was slightly misaligned, so it just nicked the edge of this before I realized what was happening. But I'm not too concerned because both pieces are going to get welded to the blade, and then I'm going to kind of machine the end of the blade, you know, flush after the welding, and it's going to clean up that little error there. Let's stand these up and see if they actually got cut in half. Alright, so was it all worth it? Whew. That is pretty close if you ask me. Let me stick a ruler on that. I don't see any light coming from one side or the other. No gaps at all. I'd say that split it just about perfect. Unbelievable. Alright, so I heard to be a real YouTuber, you gotta pimp your merch in every single video. So here we are. I paid a really excellent artist to make me some 80s inspired PHM designs, and she gave me 4 of them. I was gonna pick one, but honestly I like them all, so here they are. I got this one right here. I've got this one as well. Very nice. I really like the color scheme on this one. but I think this one's my favorite. It's kind of got like Outrun / Motley Crue vibes. Definitely right in my wheelhouse. Alright, that's it. See you on the next part.